What's up, everybody? It's Whiskey Mo, aka Morgan. Welcome everyone to another Cocktails and Policy, except for I'm recording earlier in the morning, so today we're doing coffee and policy. Tasty. Today we're going to talk about something that I've kind of been thinking about for a while. In my current graduate school program, we've been talking a lot about terrorism, insurgency, current trends, as well as great power competition and how all of that works. Which has led me to, as we've discussed things around the modern concept of war and peace and how they relate to each other, to come up with what I think is a somewhat novel way of looking at it. I am pretty sure that there's actually some professional scholar out there who's come up with a better version of this or have done this first, but I haven't quite officially seen it. So I'm going to take it on as mine, and if I will retract later if necessary. But what we are going to talk about today is going to be the peace-war spectrum. And why is this important? When we look at the past and how we've generally discussed war and peace, and especially from the idea of the general citizenry, what this means is that we look at peace and war mainly as a binary, which means that war, by definition, is the armed conflict between two nation states, and peace is the absence of war. No other explanation, but that leaves a whole lot of activities that are going to be separate and going to be different, and things that we're not going to really be able to classify in this great game between nation states. So what I see it as now as is a spectrum with peace on the far left, war on the far right, and what happens all in between. So as we look at it, this is the spectrum. We have peace and war. In this case, the definition of peace is fully the peaceful diplomatic relations between two nations. No conflict, no subterfuge, no espionage, none of that. And that war is the complete opposite of that, where two nations are engaged in armed conflict with each other. Now, in between there are steps, there are gradients, and it's not all purely militarily involved. First, we have things like tariffs and trade wars. This is something that we can see happening right now, where there's so much confusion with some of the actions of the U.S. government towards our allies. Tariffs and trade wars are not necessarily seen as things that you would do between allies. This is something, while not necessarily leading to bloodshed, it does sour the relationship between two states. So this is why it's on the left side. Next, we have things like espionage and sabotage. One of the great examples, and I will link a video from DW News where they talk about Russian shadow fleets. This is happening in the Baltic Sea right now, where some of the NATO countries are resolving to increase their patrols to counter some of the spying and some of the sabotage that is happening within the Baltic Sea. And most of them believe that this is happening because of Russian actions. And this is being done by fleets of ships that are flying false flags, that are not traditional military ships. Also, very similarly, this happens in China with a lot of fishing ships that are being used for intelligence gathering or to stake claim and to expand their economic zone. Next, we have things like unconventional warfare. Unconventional warfare are things such as using Army Special Forces to go in and train and equip rebels and resistance fighters to attempt to overthrow some sort of regime. And then there's an opposite side to this, a foreign internal defense, where you send someone similar like an Army Security Force Assistance Brigade, air advisors to train the regime to resist resistance and rebel forces. These can be both clandestine and more overt, where we have these conversations about what is happening. Some of this is public knowledge, some of it would be private knowledge, but this is getting more closely to open conflict between states. And then there's one that it kind of ranges a spectrum. What we have are limited strikes. And the reason that this is on a wider swath of the spectrum is it could be because a country is doing things that are against international laws and norms, as in like Iran attempting to build nuclear weapons. So the strikes could happen there. It could be the advent of no-fly zones in northern Iraq, where Iraqi aircraft were shot down by American forces. Or it could be something that is a prelude to war, where this is a graduated step up before a nation invades another. But all of these fit into a spectrum of what we are now calling the gray zone. And the gray zone fits in a spectrum all the way between actions just to the right of pure diplomatic or peaceful diplomatic relations between nations, all the way up to just underneath the armed conflict of nations. And this covers so many things. Some of the most recent examples of gray zone activities include things like information warfare, propaganda, attempting to influence elections in nations. One of the most recent examples has been the government of Canada has recently released a report about Chinese interference in their elections. I will link to the Digital Forensics Research Lab story about this. There was in the U.S., we've had Russian interference in elections. We also have things like Russia using money to pay YouTubers, podcasters, and content creators surreptitiously to advance Russian talking points. This was happening fairly recently, and you can see some of that in some of the news. But these are all gray zone activities, up to including unconventional warfare, espionage, and sabotage. So this fit is very light. There's so many more activities that can fit on the spectrum, but this is some of the basic ideas behind the spectrum. But what does this mean? The most important thing to understand that all of our views on warfare are conditional. They're conditional to the state of our nation, which nation that is, and how we as a nation and our culture views war. It's very easy for someone in the United States to completely misconstrue what state we are in on the spectrum. Even when there was active war fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq, there's a large portion of the population who either have forgotten or just were so unaffected by that they just forgot that we were at war and that they would consider us at peace. Even today, as we are not engaged in active conflict with a declared war, the United States government has multiple missions conducting counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, where troops are engaging in fire, and they are being seen as, would be way more right of peace than something like tariffs and trade wars. This also means that it is really improbable that true peace could really be obtained. That is very difficult because ultimately, if you take the idea of true peace to its extreme, there would be no need for military forces, and that all of the human race could coexist in a very peaceful and non-threatening manner. Now, that starts opening up the discussion to philosophy, which I won't get into here, mostly because I am not an expert in it, but you can think about how that would work. And the closest thing I believe to true peace we could have would be peace through deterrence, where everyone has the ability to defend themselves, where there's such a high cost of conflict between states that it is not worth it. But that also brings that war is very real. We can see that through examples as the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We can see that in what's happening in certain parts of the continent of Africa with power politics and invasions and peacekeeping happening there. You can see happen within all of the major strains. And so there's always a possibility of one of these conflicts leading into a new conflagration that could lead to a possible new world war. And that's something that we always need to be concerned about. But one of the most important things is the fact that gray zone activities are constantly increasing. Now, I don't want to go too in depth. I did give a brief overview, but I do want to talk more about gray zone in the future. Hopefully another Cocktails and Policy, maybe a long form video. I'm working on increasing my long form video. So if you wouldn't mind, please stick around for that. But gray zone activities are going to constantly increase, especially with the ease and ability of anyone to use any kind of technology that's available. Just this right here could be considered, if I was being paid surreptitiously by another nation to advance their, ideas that are conducive to their goals, that is gray zone activities. Even technically, this could be considered gray zone activities because my opinions and my takes generally have a more U.S. supported bend to them. So these are things that we need to constantly look out for, as well as this doesn't necessarily also equate to the ideas of actions that governments take against non-state actors, such as ISIS, ISIL, the Taliban, or not the Taliban, Al Qaeda, things of that nature, as well as internal like right-wing domestic terrorist organizations and things like that. So those are things that we can talk about later. But if you want to know more, please get into the comments. Let me know what you think about all of this. What is your opinion on the idea of a peace war spectrum, any topics that you would like to discuss, maybe some of these more in depth. I would love to have a more engaging conversation with all of you. I hope that you all have a wonderful day, wonderful weekend, wonderful life. And until next time, y'all, be well.